What would you do if your one moment of courage risked everything? The world told you didn't deserve. Helen Moore didn't plan to rewrite history. She was a night shift janitor, unseen, uncredentialed, forgotten. But when she saw the company's code failing, she didn't stay silent. She sat down and rewrote it. The next morning, the CEO found her work flawless, anonymous, undeniable. But that code didn't just fix a system. It triggered a storm. Because Helen wasn't supposed to be the solution. She was supposed to stay invisible. Now, imagine it's you. No degree, no allies, a daughter to feed, a reputation to rebuild. Would you step into the light, knowing the system could crush you again? Would you speak knowing silence is safer? This isn't a story about coding. It's about recognition. It's about what happens when a woman dares to say, "I belong here," without permission. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told to wait your turn, this story is for you. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Because sometimes, the people who clean the floors are the ones who built the foundation. Now let's begin. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed across the empty corridors of Whittech's Boston headquarters. It was nearly 1:30 outside. The city had long since exhaled into sleep, but inside the 15th floor, the silence wrapped itself around the glass walls like a blanket. Helen Moore worked in silence. Her mop moved in practiced rhythm. Not fast, not slow, just steady. The same way she lived now. Steady, cautious, unseen. Her back ached slightly from bending over the elevator baseboards earlier. At 38, she wasn't exactly old, but life had a way of stacking weight on her shoulders that no ergonomic vest could fix. She didn't complain. Complaining didn't get the bills paid. Not for a woman who'd already been through enough layoffs, heartbreaks, and closed doors to know that silence was safer. Her long auburn hair was tied in a loose braid, the kind that suggested effort but not vanity. The janitorial uniform hung loosely from her frame, and on her left shoe, a bit of electrical tape kept the sole from flapping open. She made sure no one ever saw that. Tonight, she was scheduled to finish floors 11 through 15, the last leg of the shift. She liked the top floors, quieter, cleaner, ironically, less mess. And for a few minutes on the 15th, when everyone had gone home and the world forgot this place existed, she could just breathe. But tonight, her breath caught. There it was again, that computer terminal left on, unlocked. She had passed it earlier, planning to report it to IT in the morning, but something had tugged at her. A temptation. A ghost. She glanced over her shoulder. No one. Then back at the glowing screen. She knew she shouldn't, but her fingers moved before she told them not to. Slowly, reverently. She stepped closer, her mop abandoned by the doorway. She pulled the chair out gently, sat down, and began typing. It was still there, the back-end environment. Live. Real time. Helen exhaled. She typed a quick command and the system responded. Her eyes scanned the lines of faulty code visible on the monitor. She saw the errors, the bottlenecks, the inefficiencies. It was bad. Worse than she remembered. The module hadn't been updated since the first release. She recognized the structure instantly, because she'd written it, or at least a cleaner, more refined version of it, 6 months ago, sitting on her bed with a laptop she'd rebuilt from 2 others scavenged off Facebook Marketplace. She never got a response. She never expected one. But now it was here. Her code, twisted and struggling inside a system worth millions. She couldn't help herself. With nimble fingers and a furrowed brow, she began to rewrite a key function. Cleaner recursion, more efficient memory usage, and a soft comment line, shard, original patch IRM, streamlining throughput for unstable connections. Then, the door clicked. She froze. Footsteps. A man's voice. Surprised and sharp. "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing?" She spun around in the chair. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a slate gray coat. His jaw clenched tight and his eyes narrowed beneath silver-streaked brows. She stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over the chair. I wasn't doing anything. Just cleaning. I saw it was open. I shouldn't have touched it. His eyes moved to the monitor, the code still active on the screen. Cleaning, he asked, stepping closer. This is privileged system access. You expect me to believe you were just dusting the keyboard. She didn't answer. She just stood there, jaw tight, hands trembling at her sides. The man walked around the desk, staring at the screen. After a moment of silence, he looked up. His voice was slower now, measured. You wrote this. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then nodded, just once. What's your name? Helen Moore, she said quietly. I work nights, contract through Triline Services. He looked at her longer than she was comfortable with, but it wasn't the coldness that startled her. It was the flicker of recognition, and something else. Confusion. Later, when she was gone, and the corridor had returned to its hollow stillness, Charles Whitman, CEO of Whittech Systems, stood alone in the dark office, staring at the code still glowing faintly on his terminal. The comment line read, JSH IRM, streamlining throughput for unstable connections, IRM, initials. Something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Charles Whitman didn't believe in accidents. He believed in systems, in data, in people doing exactly what you expected them to do based on where they came from, what they studied, how they presented themselves. But nothing about Helen Moore made sense. He sat alone in his office the next morning, blinds half drawn against the pale Boston sun. The double-shot espresso on his desk had gone cold. His mind replayed every detail from the night before her standing at his terminal, the code on the screen, that small line of text signed IRM, 3 letters, and a calm voice that barely trembled, even when caught red-handed. She didn't panic like someone trying to hide. She looked like someone who had long stopped expecting anyone to believe her. Charles closed the file folder in front of him. It was thin, too thin for someone who had written code that efficient. Helen Moore, hired through Triline Services 3 months ago, single mother, no formal degree in computer science. Previously employed at a local Vermont logistics firm, terminated 4 years ago under unclear circumstances. Gaps in employment, no criminal record, no notable online presence. She barely existed. But the code, he'd had his engineers review it that morning under the guise of a bug report. They were impressed, then skeptical. Recursive loops simplified, memory calls reduced by 20%, throughput stabilized. Whoever wrote it understood the system better than most of the team on payroll. Charles stared at the glowing skyline beyond the glass. Below, Whittech's headquarters spanned nearly a full city block. 2 decades ago, it had started in his garage with a few sleepless nights and more caffeine than sleep. Now it was one of Boston's quieter giants, steady. Not flashy, but lately, not steady enough. Their flagship project, an AI-integrated operations platform called Nextform, was bleeding clients. A fatal flaw in the latest update had triggered data bottlenecks in real-time systems. If they didn't patch it soon, the entire division would fold. And last night, in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and bleach, a janitor had started writing the solution. He buzzed his assistant. Call Triline. I want to speak with their floor manager about Helen Moore. A pause. Is there an issue? Sir, no, just a review. He hung up and leaned back in his chair. This wasn't a story you could explain in bullet points. He remembered the way Helen had stood, not defensive but tired, as though she'd already been judged too many times to care about this one. At 3 rewrote, Charles stood behind the glass wall of the 14th floor common area, coffee in hand. He watched as people filed out at the end of the day, engineers, designers, interns, executives. Some nodded to him politely. Some avoided eye contact. It didn't matter. They came and went like gears in a machine. But what haunted him was how easily someone like Helen could slip between those gears. He thought of her again. What drives a person to write code in secret, alone at night, on a borrowed terminal, for a company that doesn't even know her name? Not ambition, not vanity, purpose. Charles tapped his fingers against the glass. There was something else gnawing at him. Guilt. Maybe. A memory he rarely allowed space to breathe. He'd once been the outsider too, raised by a single father in Indiana, learned to code on public library computers. The industry had almost chewed him up before he built his way out. Almost. Now. The same system had swallowed someone like Helen whole, and he hadn't noticed. Until now. Later that evening, back at his penthouse, Charles sat at the kitchen island, pouring bourbon over a single ice cube. He opened his laptop and pulled up the original submission archive for the next form patch, scanned for the file he remembered opt stability, patch IRM v2.1. There it was. Dated 7 months ago. Unsolicited. No metadata. He opened it. Every line bore the same elegance he'd seen the night before. Clear logic, lean syntax, a quiet mastery that spoke louder than a resume ever could. It had been flagged, but buried deemed too risky to integrate without knowing the author. His senior devs had passed on it. Now they were weeks from disaster. He clicked open a blank email draft and typed, "Subject about last night, Helen. I've reviewed the code you were working on. It matches an anonymous submission we received months ago, one that could have saved us a great deal of time and trouble. I believe that author was you. I'd like to speak with you directly. No obligations, no assumptions, just a conversation. Tomorrow, 10 Red Leaf Cafe, Tremont Street, Charles Whitman." He hovered over the send button, then clicked. Somewhere in Keene, a single mother would open that email on an old laptop in a 2-bedroom apartment above a diner. And maybe, just maybe, the gears would start turning again. Helen didn't sleep that night. The email sat open on her second-hand laptop, its screen flickering faintly in the dark. She read it 3 times, then again, just to make sure it was real. Tomorrow. 10 M. Red Leaf Cafe, Tremont Street, Charles Whitman. She stared at the name, the title, the signature. She'd only ever heard it whispered in break rooms or printed on the sides of glossy investor pamphlets. Mr. Whitman, the architect of WitTech, the man who coded his way into fortune. And now, he wanted coffee. With her. By 9:58. She stood outside Red Leaf Cafe in her best outfit, which was really just her only button-down blouse and jeans that didn't have bleach stains. Her hair was tied back, her hands stuffed in her coat pockets to hide the tremble. The bell chimed as she entered. Charles Whitman was already there, seated in the back, sipping black coffee like he owned the place. Which, honestly, he might. He stood when he saw her, nodding politely. Helen. She approached cautiously, gripping her bag strap like a lifeline. "Mr. Whitman, please, just Charles." They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. He studied her with a gaze that wasn't predatory or skeptical. It was curious, precise, like he was scanning lines of code in a terminal window. She broke the silence. "You said you wanted to talk about the code." "I did." He sipped his coffee. "I ran it through our comparison system. It's a perfect match to the patch submitted anonymously 7 months ago. Same recursion logic, same compression routine, even the same commenting style." She didn't deny it. "I recognized it last night," she said softly. "I wasn't trying to break in. I saw the system open. I saw the code, and I knew it was mine. Why submit it anonymously?" She hesitated, then glanced out the window. "Because no one takes me seriously when I don't have a degree. No glowing LinkedIn endorsements. No one to vouch for me. I figured the only way they'd ever use my work is if they didn't know it came from me." "That's a cynical way to think," Charles said. "No." She met his gaze now, steady. "It's a practical way. I've applied to over 30 jobs in the last 2 years. Most I never even got an interview. The ones that did call back asked about the gaps in my resume, about why I left my last job, about how I've been keeping current." She gave a tired half smile. "Funny how no one ever asks what I can build." Charles leaned back slightly. This wasn't what he'd expected. He didn't know what he'd expected, but not this. Not someone so composed, so precise, so bruised, but not broken. "What happened at your last job?" he asked, quieter now. Helen let out a long breath. "I was working for a logistics firm in Vermont, mid-sized. I was the only woman on the dev team. There was a senior engineer, smart guy, charming, The kind everyone listened to even when he was wrong. He started sending me messages, inappropriate ones. Then he got bolder, hands on my shoulders, late-night comments. I told HR. Charles's jaw tightened. They said they'd investigate. A week later, I was put on administrative leave. Then they terminated my contract, said I was disruptive to team culture. She looked down at her coffee, and just like that, the door shut. No rage in her voice, no theatrics, just fact that, somehow, made it hurt more. Charles was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Why keep coding?" She gave a soft chuckle. "Because it's the only place I still feel like myself. After my daughter goes to sleep, after the dishes are done and the world has quieted, I open my laptop and I build something that listens, something that works. Code doesn't care if I'm wearing a name tag or a badge." He nodded slowly. "We've been trying to fix the Nextform backend for months. What you did in a few lines could save the entire division." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe someone should have answered my email." That made him laugh, surprised, quiet, but genuine. Fair point. He sat forward now, voice more grounded. "I want to bring you in consulting. Freelance at first. Quiet, no internal politics. Just access, a workstation, and compensation for your work." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a seat at the table," he said. "You've already saved us once. I'd like to give you the chance to do it again, but with your name on it this time." She was quiet for a long moment. Why, she finally asked. "Why now?" Charles paused. "Because I believe we're only as strong as the people we fail to see, and I'm tired of being part of the system that let you disappear." Helen leaned back, folding her arms. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. "That's fair." As she walked out into the crisp morning air, the sun hit her face in golden angles. She didn't know yet if she trusted him. She didn't know if she wanted to open that door again. But for the first time in years, someone had spoken to her like she mattered, and that was something. Helen sat in the corner booth of a quiet diner just outside Keene, stirring a cup of chamomile tea she hadn't touched. The rain tapped against the window beside her, soft and steady, like a clock counting down a decision she wasn't ready to make. Across from her sat Angie Bell, her neighbor, and the closest thing she had to a friend. "He offered you a job?" Angie asked, wide-eyed. Helen nodded. "He called it consulting, said it could be low profile, flexible." Angie raised an eyebrow. "That's not just a job. That's a bridge, a way back in." Helen looked away. "It could be, or it could be a setup, a headline, a PR stunt. You really think he'd do that?" Helen didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, slow and distracted. "I don't know what he wants. He says he wants to give me a seat at the table. But I've been near that table before." "Angie, I know what it feels like when the chair gets pulled out from under you." That night, long after Emily had fallen asleep with her stuffed bear clutched to her chest, Helen sat at the small folding desk in her bedroom, the same place she'd written the patch that had saved Wittech's backend. She opened her laptop and clicked into a folder titled Old Fires. Inside were scripts, commits, and prototypes work she'd poured herself into during the long nights when loneliness was louder than exhaustion. Code had become her language when she had no one to talk to, her structure when life felt unhinged. She paused over one file, named simply Whistle, Vermont. Xed. It wasn't code. It was a record, a timeline she'd written out the night she got home from her last job, after the email from HR, after the silence from friends, after the lawyer told her she had a credibility problem. She reread the entries. April 3rd. First, inappropriate comment, brushed it off. April 10th, repeated, bolder, no one around. April 13th, sent first email to HR, no response. April 22, HR called a culture alignment meeting. I was told I wasn't a good team fit. May 1st, terminated. No reference, no appeal. It ended with May 3rd, applied for janitorial work. Emily's birthday next week. She wants strawberry cake. Helen closed the file. Her hands trembled, but her face remained calm. She wasn't crying, not anymore. The next morning, Helen arrived at the temporary office space Charles had arranged for her. Nothing fancy, just a private workstation in a shared innovation suite at WITTEC's satellite campus. The badge said, "Contractor." The terminal was clean. The chair was hers. Charles stopped by just before noon, holding 2 coffees and a hopeful look. "You came." "I said I'd think about it," she replied, taking one of the cups. "Thinking done." He smiled. "Welcome." For the next 3 days, she worked mostly in silence. No one on the floor knew who she was. She came early, left late. Her badge didn't open most doors, and she liked it that way. She reviewed old code, drafted new modules, and began mapping out a plan to restructure the flawed AI pathways in Nextform. She also began journaling again, not just about code, but about trust, about how to navigate the thin line between healing and reopening old wounds. On Friday, Charles invited her to sit in on a virtual planning session with the lead dev team. He introduced her only as a new consultant with fresh insight. She kept her camera off, listened more than she spoke. But when they discussed a failed load balancer protocol, she couldn't help herself. "Sorry," she cut in, her voice calm but firm. "You're looking at the failure as a memory allocation problem, but it's a routing inefficiency." The virtual room went silent. One of the engineers, a man named Greg, unmuted. "And you are?" Charles leaned forward. "She's the one who wrote the recovery patch you've been trying to optimize for 2 quarters. A beat of silence. Greg scoffed. "That patch was anonymous. We were told no one claimed ownership." "Well," Charles said, "someone finally did." After the call ended, Charles turned to Helen. "You okay?" She nodded, but her expression was unreadable. "I'm used to being doubted." He tilted his head. "They'll come around." She gave a small smile. "I'm not waiting for them to come around. I'm just waiting to see if the system is really ready to change, or if it just wants to wear a different mask." That evening, as she tucked Emily into bed, the little girl whispered, "Mommy, do you still make computers smile?" Helen smiled softly. "Sometimes, sweetie. Sometimes I try." And in the quiet that followed, she felt something shift. She wasn't just building code anymore. She was building courage. By Monday morning, Helen's code had been quietly merged into 2 core systems. She hadn't been told directly, but she noticed the commit logs timestamps matching her changes, small comments from senior engineers, none of them credited to her name. And she didn't mind. Not yet. Recognition, she had learned, was often delayed. Sometimes it never came. But what mattered was that the fix worked, that the platform stabilized, that, for once, she had made something in the world a little better, whether or not anyone knew. Still, something gnawed at her. Charles met her later that day in a quiet park near Cambridge, where the leaves were just beginning to turn gold. He brought 2 coffees again, same as before, and they sat on a weathered bench beneath a sprawling oak. "I read your debug notes," he said, handing her the cup. "The route optimization's better than anything our senior team has come up with." "I've had a lot of time to think," she replied. "Late nights tend to offer that." He smiled faintly. "I'm not sure what to do with you." "Helen." She tilted her head, meaning, "You're smarter than half my leadership team, more grounded than most of my engineers, and yet you work in silence, in the shadows. You're not asking for a title, or equity, or even credit." Helen's gaze didn't waver. "You offered a seat. I'm still deciding if the table is worth sitting at." Charles paused. "What would make it worth it?" She took a long sip from her cup before answering. Not being treated like a risk, that hit him, harder than he expected. Because it was true, she was a risk. Not because of her talent, but because of how the system had failed her before. Because her story, if told, would raise questions the company had long ignored about hiring practices, corporate loyalty, retaliation, silence. WITTEC had built its success on talent that looked good on paper. Helen looked like a footnote, and yet she had fixed what no one else could. Back at the office, whispers had begun to swirl. Greg Tuller, the senior engineer who had challenged Helen on the Zoom call, was not known for letting things go. "She doesn't have credentials," he murmured to one of the junior devs. No degree, no track record, just a janitor who wrote some clever code. We can't let this become the new standard. That comment made its way to Charles within the hour. He called Greg into his office. "You've got a problem with Helen's work?" he asked. Greg crossed his arms. "Her work is fine. It's her presence I question. We're setting a precedent here, bypassing protocol, rewarding anonymous uploads, promoting someone who hasn't been vetted." Charles stood slowly, voice calm. "She's been vetted the hard way. Life did that already." Greg didn't flinch. "I'm telling you, this will blow back on us." Charles nodded. "Maybe. But if we lose people like her, we deserve it." That evening, Helen found a folded note on her desk. "Check your inbox." She opened her laptop. A single message. Subject: "What would it take, Helen? I'm not asking for a resume. I'm asking for vision. If you had a project, any project that could change how this company works, what would it be? Let's build something that fixes more than code." Charles. She stared at the screen, stunned. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then slowly, she began to type. By midnight, she had outlined a proposal, a restructured internal development framework for WITTech focused on anonymous prototyping, blind code reviews, and merit-based recognition systems. No names, no biases, just raw innovation. She called it the Mirror Initiative because, she wrote, "It shows us what we're afraid to see in ourselves and in each other." She hit send, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was knocking on a locked door. She felt like she was building a new one. The boardroom on the 17th floor of WITTech's main tower hadn't changed in 20 years. Walnut walls, frosted glass, and chairs that whispered money and tradition. Helen had only seen it once before from a distance, pushing her cleaning cart down the hall late one night. Now, she was standing inside it, not as staff, but as subject. Charles paced slowly near the long table, holding a printed version of the Mirror Initiative. It was marked with tabs and underlines, and he had clearly read it more than once. "This isn't just a technical shift," he said, addressing the small group of executives and board members seated before him. "It's cultural, philosophical, and it's long overdue." At the far end, Greg Tuller leaned back, arms crossed, expression carved in skepticism. "You want us to restructure our internal system," Greg said, based on the recommendations of a woman who was pushing a mop here 2 weeks ago. Charles didn't flinch. A woman whose code saved our flagship platform. A woman who outperformed an entire team of engineers. Greg raised an eyebrow. "Is that our new hiring process?" "Wait for someone to break protocol and then promote them." Helen stood by the wall, quiet, calm, watching. She had insisted on being present, though Charles had warned her it would be hostile. She said she didn't mind. After years of being erased, she preferred to be underestimated face to face. "Let's talk about risk," one board member said, a silver-haired man in a tailored vest. "If we implement this system, we admit our past processes were flawed. That opens the door to scrutiny, internal and external." "Then let them scrutinize," Charles said evenly. "If we're not willing to be examined, we don't deserve to lead." Greg laughed dryly. "You're staking our future on sentiment. This is a liability disguised as inspiration." Finally, Helen spoke. "I'm not here to be inspiring," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I know how to solve problems you can't even see." All heads turned. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "The code I wrote quietly, without pay, without permission, wasn't lucky. It was the result of years of work. Work I did between diaper changes and night shifts, because the door to places like this was locked to people like me." "And what kind of people are people like you?" Greg asked, tone sharp. Helen looked at him. "People who aren't invited to meetings like this unless someone needs a redemption arc." The room fell silent. Charles broke it. "We failed her once. I don't intend to do it again." Greg stood abruptly. "You think this is noble, Charles, but what you're doing is dangerous." I pulled her employment history. She was fired for cause at her last tech job, refused to cooperate with her team, accused a respected manager of harassment with no supporting evidence. Helen's jaw tightened. Charles turned to her. "Is that true?" She nodded, slow and small. That's what the record says. Is it accurate? He asked. No, she said, but it was easier to believe him than to believe me. Greg scoffed. There it is. No proof, just story. Helen looked around the table, meeting each gaze with unwavering eyes. I was told to be quiet, to be grateful, to go away. I lost my career because I spoke up. I lost friends, opportunities. But I didn't lose my ability. And now you're afraid of what happens if someone like me actually gets heard. Another board member, a woman named Diane, cleared her throat. Charles, if this goes public, I'll own it, he said simply. This isn't PR. This is personal. I'm not protecting Helen for a headline. I'm building a company worth belonging to. The chairman, a tall, stern woman named Margaret Ellis, raised her hand for silence. We'll vote on whether to pilot the Mirror Initiative for a 3-month trial, she said. But before we do, I want to ask Helen one question. Helen turned to her. You're here now, Margaret said, not just in the building, but in the room. After everything that's happened, why didn't you walk away? Helen paused, the weight of the question pressing against every cracked part of her past. Then she answered, because I have a daughter who's watching, and I want her to see that some doors can be opened from the inside, later, outside the boardroom. Helen leaned against the wall, her breath shallow. Charles stood beside her, quiet. That was... He began. She shook her head. Don't say anything yet. They waited. 30 minutes later, Margaret stepped out and approached them. We'll move forward with the pilot, she said, quietly. For now, you have 3 months. Helen met her gaze. That's all I need. Margaret nodded, then left, without another word. Charles looked at Helen, admiration in his eyes. You didn't just hold your ground in there. You built a new one. Helen exhaled. Let's see if it holds. Helen stood alone on the rooftop garden of Whittech's Innovation Wing. The city stretched around her, a patchwork of steel and silence. Evening light flickered off the buildings like quiet applause no one could hear. The vote had gone through. The Mirror Initiative would begin. And yet, she didn't feel victorious. Inside her coat pocket, her phone buzzed again. From unknown subject. Just thought you should know. They're leaking your file to the press, your past. Vermont. The complaint. Everything. Anonymous. She stared at the screen, breath caught. It was happening again. 30 minutes later, she sat across from Charles in his office, her expression unreadable, but her hands balled into fists on her lap. They're using my story as a weapon, she said. Again. Charles had already seen the early headline on his second monitor, Whittech's secret architect accused of fabricating harassment in past Job. They're twisting it, he said quietly. But we can push back. Clarify. Helen looked at him sharply. Clarify what? Charles. That a woman with no degree wrote code better than your salaried engineers, that she was fired for telling the truth and now dares to be seen again. He didn't speak. She stood. I told you I wasn't here to be a headline, and you promised this wouldn't happen. I know, he said, and I failed you. But please don't walk away. Not now. She turned toward the door. It's not about walking away. It's about survival. Again. Back at her apartment, Helen moved like a shadow. Emily was at Angie's for the evening, which gave Helen space but no peace. She opened her laptop, stared at the same empty blinking cursor in her journal. The same space she filled with code now refused to be filled with words. The emails were pouring in, some supportive, some venomous, most anonymous. She closed the laptop, stood, walked to the window and stared out at the rows of quiet porches and parked cars. All her life, she had kept her head down. Until now. Now. They wanted her to kneel. The next day, Charles sent a message, not through email, not through an assistant. A printed letter, hand-delivered. It read, Helen, you told me this might happen, and I didn't do enough to prevent it. I let protocol and process convince me that silence would shield you. That was cowardice. I don't want to fix this behind closed doors. I want to stand beside you, publicly, loudly. And if that costs me something, good. That means I'm finally spending the capital I've hoarded. But I can't do it without your consent. Let me fight with you, not for you. Charles Helen read it 3 times, then once more, aloud. It was not flowery, not perfect, but it was human. That night, she sat on the edge of Emily's bed, brushing a curl from her daughter's cheek. "Mommy," Emily mumbled sleepily. "Are people being mean to you again?" Helen swallowed. "A little? Are you gonna fix it? I'm thinking about how—" Emily blinked once. "Just make them look at the real you." Helen kissed her forehead, out of the mouths of children. The next morning, Helen arrived at Whittech early. She walked past the receptionist, past the stairs, past the murmurs. Charles was waiting outside the executive lounge, pacing. When he saw her, he stopped. "You came. I'm not here for a press release," she said. "Good," he replied. "Neither am I." They walked together into a quiet studio on the 16th floor, set up for internal town halls and live streams. Charles stepped behind the podium, cameras already in place. He looked at her one last time. "Still want this?" She nodded. "I'm done letting other people tell my story." 2 hours later, the video had gone live. Charles stood beside Helen in the frame as he spoke. "What you've read may be true in paperwork, but not in truth. Helen Moore wrote the code that stabilized our core product. She also wrote, years ago, a complaint that was ignored and buried by a different system, one that discarded her instead of listening. Today, Whittech acknowledges that silence is complicity, and we choose to listen." Then Helen stepped forward, her voice calm. "I'm not perfect. I'm not credentialed, but I am capable. I've worked alone, in silence, for too long. And if you can't see the value in someone like me, it's not because we don't exist. It's because you've trained yourself not to look." The backlash came, but so did the support. Former colleagues, other women in tech, mothers, fathers, janitors, developers. Voices rose. For once, not in anger, but in recognition. The letter came by courier, no return address. Just a crisp white envelope with Helen's name spelled in careful black ink. She knew what it was before she opened it. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the first lines, "To Ms. Helen Moore. You are hereby notified that you are named as a central figure in a forthcoming civil investigation involving proprietary code claimed by Solentra Dynamics, Inc., a Vermont-based tech firm. The code in question is currently embedded in the Whittech Nextform platform. They were accusing her of theft." Charles stormed into the legal department later that morning, eyes burning. "This is retaliation," he said flatly, tossing the letter on the table. Whittech's legal counsel looked pale. They're claiming the original codebase used in the Nextform patch was authored during Helen's prior employment at Solentra. They're alleging she uploaded company property to an external system, violating NDAs and IP law. She wasn't even employed when she wrote that code. Charles said, "They're claiming otherwise. They have a signed employment agreement on file that overlaps the submission date." Charles blinked. "That's not possible." Helen sat in the corner of the meeting room, small but composed, her silence louder than Charles's anger. "This is what they do," she said finally. "They wait. Then they reappear when you've made just enough progress for them to want a piece." One of the lawyers glanced at her. "They're using your original HR file too, painting you as emotionally unstable, saying this is part of a pattern." Helen gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Of course they are." Charles leaned forward, voice cold now. "We fight this." Helen turned to him, her expression tired. "Charles, this isn't your burden." "Yes," he said, "it is." The news broke 2 days later. Solentra claims IP theft in Whittech code breakthrough. Helen's name was everywhere, but this time, so was her voice. She posted a single statement on her own page, one she hadn't touched in years. "I wrote that code after my termination. I wrote it in my daughter's bedroom at 2 a.m. on a used laptop I repaired with YouTube tutorials. I submitted it anonymously because I didn't trust the system. Turns out, the system still doesn't trust me." That night, she couldn't sleep. Emily was curled up beside her, breathing softly. Helen stared at the ceiling. Doubt pressed against her like static in her chest. Had she made a mistake going public? Had she endangered Charles, the company? Her daughter's future. She got out of bed and opened her laptop, clicked through old folders, traced each step of her work timestamps, logs, emails she'd sent to herself. Proof, maybe not enough for court, but enough to remind herself she hadn't imagined it. Charles called the next morning. "I'm filing a counterclaim," he said. "We're asserting joint authorship between you and Whittech on the patch." Helen hesitated. "Won't that make things worse for who?" he asked. "Them for me," she whispered. Charles paused. "You've spent years hiding your name behind silence. Don't let them use it now like it belongs to them." 3 weeks passed. The case moved fast. Solentra's lawyers were aggressive. They pulled internal memos, emails, hearsay. Their strategy was clear smear. Helen cast doubt, grind her down. Charles shielded her from the worst of it. But some things slipped through. One morning, she received a forwarded link, an op-ed, thinly veiled, the myth of the outsider genius. How startups elevate the wrong stories. It didn't mention her name. It didn't have to. Backstage at Whittech's legal prep office, Helen stood in front of a full-length mirror. She was wearing a dark gray blazer Charles had insisted on buying her. "You look confident," he said, appearing behind her. She didn't turn. "I don't feel confident. You don't have to. Just be truthful. That's what got me here in the first place," she murmured. He rested a hand on her shoulder. "You told me once that you don't code for recognition, that you code because it's the only thing that listens. Now it's your turn to speak, and people are finally listening." She nodded. But deep inside, a storm still swirled. That evening, she walked into her apartment, exhausted. The floor creaked beneath her. A dish sat in the sink. A school flyer was taped to the fridge. She looked around the small, lived-in space. No medals, no trophies, but everything here was built by survival, by love, by effort no one ever saw. And she thought, if this falls apart, at least they'll know I tried. On my terms. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that settles before a verdict, or a storm. Helen sat behind the plaintiff's table, palms pressed together in her lap, knuckles white. The wood of the bench was cold, and so was the air inside her chest. Across the aisle, Solentra's lead attorney shuffled through a thick binder, wearing a smile that wasn't quite a smile. Beside him sat a woman Helen didn't recognize, some executive, likely handpicked to look reasonable, credible, safe. Charles sat beside Helen, hands folded, expression hard. He had offered to testify. She hadn't decided if that made her feel stronger or more exposed. The judge entered, gavel struck wood, and the trial began. Solentra's opening argument was polished, rehearsed, and predictably cruel. They painted Helen as a disgruntled former employee, said she held on to sensitive internal frameworks after her termination, claimed her anonymous code submission was a calculated attempt to manipulate public perception and capitalize on Whittech's recent struggles. She is not a creator, their lawyer declared, voice smooth as lacquer. She is a thief of opportunity, one who leveraged the optics of struggle to gain access, influence, and ultimately credit. Helen didn't blink. She'd heard worse. Charles was called next, on the stand. He spoke slowly and clearly. "She didn't come to me. I found her. And when I saw what she had written, how it worked, how elegant it was, I knew. That wasn't theft. That was talent buried beneath years of silence." The opposing counsel tried to discredit him. "You've made public statements defending Ms. Moore. You admit to assigning her significant internal work despite her questionable history." Charles nodded, because her work spoke louder than her resume and louder than her past. When it was Helen's turn, her feet felt heavy walking to the stand. Her breath caught once, halfway there. But when she sat down and looked out not at the judge, not at the jury, but at Charles and the row of strangers in the gallery, her spine straightened. Her voice, when it came, was low but unwavering. "I wrote that code, alone, in my apartment, after my daughter was asleep. I submitted it anonymously because I knew no one would look at me and see what I could do. They'd only see who I used to be. She turned slightly toward the jury. Yes, I was fired. Yes, I filed a complaint against my manager. And yes, I was branded as difficult, unstable, unqualified. But none of that changed what I knew, what I could build, or what I did build. She paused. I didn't come here to erase my past. I came to prove that it never defined me in the first place. Solentra's attorney stood. And what proof do you have that the code in question is yours and not derivative of your former employer's protected materials? Helen reached down and lifted a folder from the side table. Inside were printed emails, dated and time-stamped from her personal inbox, sent to herself, versions of the code, notes, backups, even video clips of her screen as she debugged the first draft. These were created weeks after my termination, she said, handing them to the bailiff, all with metadata intact. The courtroom murmured. The judge scanned the pages, then nodded slowly. Solentra's attorney objected, then requested recess, denied. An hour later, the verdict came. The judge's voice was clear. This court finds no legal grounds to support Solentra Dynamics' claim of intellectual property theft. Furthermore, it affirms the joint ownership between Ms. Moore and Whittek over the submitted framework. Case dismissed. Gasps. Silence. Then a few hushed sighs of relief. Helen sat still. Then she closed her eyes, just for a moment, and breathed. Outside, as the press gathered and microphones pointed like arrows, Helen and Charles exited side by side. She spoke first, into the sea of cameras. I'm not a symbol. I'm not a cause. I'm a developer who was told I didn't belong. And now, I'm still here. 6 months later. The auditorium buzzed with a quiet energy, the kind that only settles before something honest is about to be said. The Boston Tech Futures Summit wasn't where Helen Moore ever expected to find herself. But there she stood, center stage, beneath soft white lights, in front of hundreds of leaders, engineers, students, and skeptics. No mop, no badge, no shadows. Just a microphone, and her name, finally on the program. Charles introduced her, short and clear. She didn't knock on the door. She built her own. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Helen Moore. Applause rose as she stepped forward. Calm, simple navy blazer, hair tied back. Her only accessory was a silver pendant, a gift from Emily, shaped like a small gear. She took a breath, then spoke. 6 years ago, I was told I didn't belong in this industry. I was told I was too emotional, too quiet, too inconsistent. So I disappeared. Not because I gave up, but because I got tired of proving I was real to people who only believed in resumes and conference badges. She paused. The room held still. But here's the truth. Talent doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes it enters through the service elevator. Sometimes it works the night shift. Sometimes it wears overalls instead of credentials. A few quiet nods rippled through the crowd. I built code at 2 a.m. in a 2-bedroom apartment above a diner. I sent it into the world with no name attached, because I didn't trust the system to see me without judging me. And you know what? The system didn't, but the code still worked. Behind the stage, Charles stood with arms folded, watching. Not as a CEO anymore, but as someone who had learned what real leadership looked like. It looked like humility, like courage, not framed on a wall, but written in silence. Over time, Helen continued. We launched the Mirror Initiative at Whittek 5 months ago. In that time, we've accepted 119 code contributions anonymously. The top 10% of those contributors have now been offered formal contracts, most of them people who didn't even have LinkedIn pages. We don't ask for names first. We ask for what they can build. The applause this time came louder, not explosive, but deep, honest. After the event, people lined up to speak with her. Young developers, older engineers, a mother with a teenage daughter, a man who'd left tech 10 years ago and wondered if maybe now he could come back. She listened, nodded, smiled. Her voice had moved them, but her presence had changed something more fundamental. She had become proof. Later that week, she returned to Keene. The old apartment was still hers. Not because she couldn't move, but because she liked it. The creaky floors, the view of the trees, the sound of birds on Sunday mornings. Emily was in the kitchen, making a mess of flour and strawberries. "Mom," she called. "Can I code before bed if I clean up after Helen laughed?" "Deal." As she stood at the window, a warm wind came through the screen. She closed her eyes for a moment. So much had changed, but deep down, she was still the same woman, still quiet, still resilient, still writing her own version of what strength looked like. Not loud, not sharp, but enduring. She never raised her voice. She never begged to be seen. She simply kept showing up again and again until the world had no choice but to listen. Helen Moore's story isn't just about triumph. It's about what we miss when we look past someone because of their job title, their past, their silence. It's a reminder that talent doesn't come in one shape, and brilliance doesn't always walk in through the front door. But let's be clear, what Helen faced was not just oversight. It was discrimination. It was a system that rewards appearance over ability, comfort over truth. And it still happens every day to women, to working-class people, to anyone who dares to speak without permission. So let this story stay with you. Ask yourself, how many Helens have we overlooked? How many doors could we open if only we chose to see differently? And if this story moved you, if it made you feel, think, or question, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, because the next voice you hear might be the one the world needs most. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, keep listening for what's not being said.